A graveyard of empires. A title earned through centuries of conflict and resistance. Afghanistan. A land of soaring mountains and unforgiving deserts. Its rugged terrain has been both a sanctuary and a battlefield, shaping the destiny of those who dare to conquer it, a crossroads of civilizations but also a battleground for millennia. Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, the British Empire, each sought to impose their will, only to be met with fierce resistance. All tasted the fierce resistance of this land, their dreams of conquest swallowed by its unforgiving embrace. The harsh climate, the treacherous mountains and the resilient people formed an impenetrable barrier. Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, a title that echoes through history, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people. By the late 20th century, it was the Soviet Union's turn to learn this lesson. Their invasion in 1979 marked the beginning of a brutal conflict. A decade of occupation ended in a humiliating withdrawal, leaving Afghanistan in the grip of civil war. The Soviet forces, once mighty, were reduced to a retreating shadow. From the ashes of this conflict rose the Taliban, a brutal regime that enforced its strict interpretation of Islamic law with an iron fist. Their rise to power was swift and merciless. In the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan descended into chaos. Warlords battled for control, each carving out their own fiefdoms amidst the ruins. The people, caught in the crossfire, endured unimaginable suffering. Families were torn apart, homes destroyed and lives shattered by the relentless violence. It was in this crucible of violence and despair that the Taliban emerged, promising order and unity. They capitalized on the people's desperation, offering a semblance of stability in exchange for absolute control. The American arrival. The world watched in horror as the Taliban transformed Afghanistan into a haven for terrorists. The regime's brutal enforcement of their interpretation of Islamic law led to widespread human rights abuses, particularly against women and minorities. Afghanistan became a breeding ground for extremist ideologies, attracting militants from around the globe. Then came September 11, 2001, a day that would forever change the course of history. The world watched in shock and disbelief as the twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York City were struck by hijacked planes. The attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. shook America to its core. The Pentagon, the heart of the nation's defense, was also targeted, symbolizing an assault on the very fabric of American power and security. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the attacks, found refuge in Afghanistan, sheltered by the Taliban. His presence in the country underscored the deep connections between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, making Afghanistan a focal point in the global war on terror. America, wounded but resolute, responded with unwavering force. Operation Enduring Freedom, the invasion of Afghanistan. This marked the beginning of a prolonged conflict aimed at dismantling terrorist networks and bringing those responsible for the attacks to justice. American troops joined by allies drove the Taliban from power in a matter of weeks. The swift military campaign showcased the might of the coalition forces and their determination to eradicate the terrorist threat. Their mission: dismantle Al-Qaeda, deny terrorists a safe haven, and help the Afghan people build a better future. The efforts included rebuilding infrastructure, establishing governance, and providing humanitarian aid, all aimed at stabilizing the region and preventing the resurgence of extremist groups. The wait of 20 years. The early years held promise: a new constitution, democratic elections, schools and hospitals were built. Women, once relegated to the shadows, tasted newfound freedom. But the Taliban, though driven from power, were not defeated. They retreated to the mountains, regrouped, and waited. The war dragged on, year after year, claiming the lives of thousands of Afghans and hundreds of American and Allied soldiers. The optimism of the early years faded. Corruption plagued the Afghan government. The Taliban, exploiting the growing disillusionment, launched a relentless insurgency. Suicide bombings, targeted assassinations, the cycle of violence seemed endless. The Fall of Kabul. By 2021, after 2 decades of war, America's patience had worn thin. The conflict had cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, with no clear end in sight. The American public, weary of the endless cycle of violence, demanded change. President Biden, facing mounting domestic pressure, made the difficult decision to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan. He believed that the Afghan government and its military were prepared to stand on their own, a belief that would soon be tested. The withdrawal, intended to be orderly and phased, quickly unraveled. As U.S. forces began to leave, the fragile stability of the region started to collapse. The speed of the withdrawal caught many by surprise, leaving a power vacuum that the Taliban were quick to exploit. As the Taliban sensed weakness, they launched a lightning offensive, sweeping across the country with astonishing speed. City after city fell. The Afghan military, despite years of training and support from the U.S., was unable to mount a significant defense. The Afghan army, riddled with corruption and demoralized after years of fighting, crumbled in the face of the Taliban advance. Panic set in. Soldiers abandoned their posts and entire units surrendered without a fight. The sense of impending doom was palpable. The Afghan government, its authority collapsing, pleaded for help. Desperate calls were made to international allies, but the response was tepid. The world watched in shock as the situation deteriorated rapidly, but it was too late. The institutions that had been built over the past 2 decades were crumbling. Government buildings were abandoned, and the streets of Kabul, once bustling with activity, were eerily quiet. Kabul, the capital, was now in the Taliban's sights. The city descended into chaos as residents tried to flee, fearing for their lives. The fall of Kabul marked the end of an era and the beginning of an uncertain future for Afghanistan. August 15, 2021, Kabul fell. The scenes that unfolded were chaotic and heartbreaking. Thousands of Afghans, terrified of the Taliban's return, rushed to the airport, desperate to flee. Men, women, children, all clamoring for a place on a departing plane. American soldiers and diplomats, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people, worked tirelessly to evacuate as many as possible. But for every person they managed to get out, countless others were left behind. The air was thick with fear, desperation, and the roar of departing aircraft. Amidst the chaos, stories of courage, compassion, and heartbreaking loss emerged. Afghan interpreters who had risked their lives alongside American soldiers were now targets. Their service, once a source of pride, had become a death sentence. Many were left behind, their fate uncertain. Families were torn apart. Mothers forced to make impossible choices, handing their babies to soldiers over airport walls, hoping against hope that they would find safety in a distant land. The images beamed around the world seared themselves into the global consciousness. The withdrawal marked the end of America's longest war, but it also ushered in a new age of uncertainty. The Taliban, now back in power, promised a more moderate rule. But old fears quickly resurfaced. Women were once again confined to their homes, denied education and employment. Minorities faced persecution. The hard-won gains of 2 decades seemed to evaporate overnight. The international community watched with a mix of anger and despair. Sanctions were imposed. Aid was cut off. But the Taliban, unmoved, consolidated their grip on power. Afghanistan once again became a pariah state. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan had far-reaching consequences. America's image on the world stage was tarnished, its credibility damaged. Allies questioned America's resolve, its willingness to stand by its commitments. The withdrawal emboldened adversaries who saw in America's retreat a sign of weakness. The human cost was immeasurable. Thousands of Afghans who had dared to hope for a better future were now living under the Taliban's oppressive rule. The dreams of a generation nurtured over 2 decades were shattered. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan was a tragedy on many levels. It was a failure of intelligence, a failure of planning, and a failure of political will. But above all, it was a failure of empathy. A failure to truly understand the human cost of war, the enduring impact of our actions. The ghosts of Afghanistan will continue to haunt us. The images of that chaotic withdrawal, the stories of those left behind, will serve as a stark reminder of the price of indifference. The world is watching, and history will judge.